In the ancient world, a person's reputation was won and lost in the company of others, the company that they kept. The ancient Greeks wrote whole books providing examples, exhaustive examples, of the types of people to emulate and the types of people to avoid. Books like Theophrastus's Characters and Plutarch's Lives. The hope and the fear was that the character of the people you associate with would gradually imprint on you, like an image is imprinted on a coin. And it makes me realize that if I had only known in high school that by our strict division into the various cliques and groups that we associated with, we were actually manifesting the wisdom of the ancient Greeks, it would have felt so much better. Well, I was a band geek in high school. Were there any other band geeks in high school? Few. And I don't know about your high school, but in my high school, I think the band geeks were sort of about midway on the social spectrum between the popular kids and the potheads. There was a certain benefit to being at the middle of the social spectrum because it meant I could get away with a certain amount of fraternizing with kids on either end. So that may explain how I ended up unwittingly dating a pothead. Of course, now that we've legalized marijuana and cleaned up our language, I'm sure there's no such thing as a pothead anymore in high schools. But all that is to say, we are not as far removed as we might like to think from the world of Theophrastus and Plutarch and Jesus and the Pharisees. In the social hierarchy of Jesus' day, in Jewish society, Pharisees and scribes were near the top of the social hierarchy, and tax collectors and sinners were obviously at the bottom. Now, sinners included the tax collectors because even though they had money, they served the Roman overlords and they extorted their own people. So they were especially despised. Turncoats and traitors. You know, you can find lots of justifications for the other outcasts that Jesus associated with, but I've never heard a good defense of his friendliness to the tax collectors. Didn't he know who these people were? Well, other sinners, as we see them depicted throughout the Gospels, of course, included women who were especially typecast as sexual sinners because, of course, they didn't have control over a lot more than their bodies. Maybe they didn't even have that much control of their bodies. So they tend to get categorized in with the sexual sinners. So they're often seen as prostitutes or adulterers in the Bible. And then, of course, you had the people with diseases that were believed to be the result of sin, or maybe even the sin of their parents manifest in them. You had the so-called demon-possessed, who clearly had been consorting with the wrong types, and you had lawbreakers of all stripes. Well, what was especially galling about Jesus is that he should have known better. He was a rabbi, after all. At least if you can take away some of what we learn from the Gospels about Jesus being able to read the Torah and actually teach, he must have had some education. And he developed a reputation as a teacher of teachers, a great rabbi. So I wonder, although this isn't exactly explicit in the Gospels, if you read between the lines, I wonder if the Pharisees initially might have thought of Jesus as a natural ally. Think of that wonderful story of the Pharisee Nicodemus approaching Jesus at night and asking him about who he was as a teacher of Israel. And so maybe the Pharisees had good reason to think he should only show up at their dinner parties. So why was it, they demanded to know, that he was going about eating promiscuously with all kinds of people, all kinds of sinners and undesirables who had who knows what kinds of communicable diseases? So they grumbled. This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them. And now this eating thing, have you noticed how many meals there are in the Gospels? How much Jesus focuses on food? Jesus is constantly going about feeding people or being a guest of somebody at their home, eating with them. And he does eat at all kinds of homes and with all kinds of people. He even lets women approach him at the table. Well, John Dominic Crossan, who's a very well-known New Testament scholar, explains why Jesus' practice of open table fellowship was so offensive in that time. This was a society in which, as I said at the beginning, you lived or died by your reputation, by who you associated with. And even to this day, if you study anthropology, you'll find that when anthropologists go in to a new culture, one of the ways they try to figure out how the society works is to study who eats with whom and when and where. Because table fellowship, Dominic Crossan says, really is a way of exposing the map of the social hierarchy. It's the society in miniature at the table. Well, so we may not have potheads today, but I do think we can learn a lot about our society and about ourselves by looking at who we eat with, or more broadly, who we feel comfortable spending time with in our free time. And although we don't have the same social hierarchies that we had in the past, today more than ever, we seem to be focused on identifying our tribe, on identifying who we feel is in our in-group and who are those others that we need to be suspicious of because they think the wrong way or believe the wrong way, dress the wrong way, or in whatever other way are really different enough from us that they make us uncomfortable. One of the New Testament scholars that I sometimes listen in on is Matt Skinner, professor at Luther Seminary. And when he was reflecting on this passage, he said, polarization is a hell of a drug. Polarization is a hell of a drug. And our church, in many ways, is imitating our broader society and allowing ourselves to become polarized. And unfortunately, churches are increasingly polarized, of course, between progressives and evangelicals and fundamentalists and liberals. And as much as we would like to think that we are more often the victims and the scapegoats by being on the progressive end of the spectrum, I think it's fair to say that, we have our own internal critic that operates in our own minds as we look at people of different religious backgrounds or more conservative backgrounds. But I think one of the most dangerous things happening today has less to do with religion or theology and a lot more to do with what I would call the politics of resentment. And I don't think the Pharisees and scribes' criticisms of Jesus really had all that much to do about religion or theology in a way. I think they had a lot more to do about the politics of resentment. The idea of what you might want to call social scarcity. They wanted to keep Jesus all to himself. And they felt threatened when the undeserving were horning in on their slice of the pie, on getting the goods with Jesus as they were. And resentment is looking at somebody else and thinking that person doesn't deserve what they have. Why do they get that? Whereas I deserve more. I deserve more than what I have, clearly. And if life is a zero-sum game, whether it's social standing or climbing the career ladder or our, financial resources, if life is a zero-sum game, then if some have more, it must mean I'm going to get less. And I really think this is part of what was going on with the Pharisees. And I loved another professor. I listen to this podcast often when we're on the lectionary from it's called Working Preacher, and it's put on by Luther Seminary. And another one of the speakers on this podcast this past week, named Rolf Jacobson, said that the only cure for resentment is gratitude. Have you ever noticed that the more gratitude you feel, the less room there is for resentment in your hearts? And Rolf talked about visiting a doctor. He was visiting a doctor who was in the hospital, not as a doctor, but as a patient. And as he was visiting this doctor, lying on the bed there in the hospital, the doctor told him that resentment is swallowing poison and waiting for your enemy to die. Swallowing poison and waiting for your enemy to die. And I wonder if that's not how often we become lost. I wonder if that's not how the Pharisees lost their way in Jesus' time. Because they were so full of resentment at Jesus hobnobbing with these sinners, and how that might reflect, let's be honest, on them. If they associated with Jesus and these people associated with Jesus, what would that say about them? And so they become lost. And so I started thinking, as I was preparing this sermon, about a time when I felt profoundly lost. And I want to invite you for a moment to try to bring into your mind a time when you felt lost. And I'd like to invite you just to close your eyes for just a moment, look inside, and try to pull up a memory of a time when you felt lost. So let me tell you about my experience. It feels almost like yesterday, which is kind of what happens when something imprints itself on you indelibly, whether it's great joy or great suffering. But when I was in college, I really struggled for the first couple of years because it just happened in the timing that was my life, that it was my freshman year in college that I fell into my first relationship with a woman, fell in love with a woman for the first time. And I happened to have chosen a Southern Baptist college in South Carolina to go to. God knows why. I was from Florida, but that's where I went. And at the Southern Baptist College in the early 1980s, there were a few things that would have been worse or more taboo than being in a same-gender relationship. And I knew this, obviously, and so I went into a sort of deep closet. And really there was, I know some of you will know what I'm talking about. If you've ever done anything that somehow you knew you weren't supposed to be doing, there is this great fear of exposure. So you have to put up walls around yourself and keep people out, because if they get too close to you, they might learn the deep, dark secret you're carrying inside. So I kind of became isolated. And when that relationship fell apart, I really had no friends. And it was a very deep, dark time for me. And but I had this one lifeline. And that was the fact that I had already felt a call to ministry. So I had enrolled in something called the pre-ministerial program at this school. Because even though it was Southern Baptist, some of the faculty and the chaplain were actually more enlightened and thought women could actually be ministers. And so I was in this pre-ministerial program. And I got to know the chaplain, James Pitts. And he was a wonderful man. Never in my wildest dreams would I have thought to come forward to him with what I was struggling with. But I did have a sort of innate sense of trust in him. And he had a party at his house for we pre-ministerial students, and he invited me to come. And I was terrified. But I went. Something in me said, you need to go to his house and put yourself out there. So I went. And I will never forget to this day the feeling I had. I was surrounded by these perfectly nice people, but it was like I was looking at them through a glass wall, and it was hard to reach them or to be reached. And yet, I had this feeling of being in this warmth and this light, and it felt like maybe sometime that wall of glass or ice would be able to be pierced or melt, and I might be set free. And someone might be able to get through to me, and I to them. And so it gave me a sense of hope that I might be able to make friends at my college, and I might overcome the situation in which I found myself. And it took another year or two for that to happen. But I'm sure that one brief moment, that window into human fellowship again, kept me going until I got to a little bit better place and was able to start to make new friends. So why was I lost? Obviously, I was lost because I felt like a sinner. I saw myself as a sinner. But worse than that, I think I had become my own worst Pharisee. I had internalized all the homophobic messages around me. And I was the one who was policing myself. No one else had to do it for me. So that brings us to the quote from Richard Rohr, which is our modern testimony today. Our shadow self is any part of ourselves or institutions that we try to hide or deny because it seems socially unacceptable. He goes on to talk about shadow boxing, making friends with our own mistakes and failings. And he goes on in one of his other books called Falling Upward to talk about how the more fervently we try to be perfect, the more fervently we try to conform to what we believe to be all the standards around us, the worse off we are. And how Jesus talks so much about Pharisees and tax collectors because there's this ironic truth that Jesus opens up for us, that the characters in the Gospels that are doing their life perfectly right end up being in the wrong. And the ones that are doing it all wrong end up being closest, coming closest to God and being most beloved. So this incredible story of these two parables, of this persistent, insistent God who will not rest until God finds the lost, says something to us about our calling as followers of Jesus and of the church. We are called to be the place where all are welcome and none are lost. We won't be perfect at it, and the harder we try to be perfect at it, the worse our shadow side will get, and that's the contradiction of human life. But we can aspire to the reign of God, the beloved community that Jesus models for us and holds out to us to attract us. We can aspire to be, as the church, the place where all are welcome and none are lost. So maybe if we take a page from this parable of the woman and the lost coin, we're called to the hard work of sweeping out our old notions of worthiness and righteousness and sin, and we're called to a true repentance, which is not to beat up on oneself and feel guilty. As we know from anti-racism conversations, white guilt's not doing anybody any good. So we're not called to feel guilty. We are called to allow our minds to be changed and our hearts to be transformed and our actions to follow. So an attentive and careful search for those who remain on the outside of our warm, lighted communities of faith is what we are called to do. So in closing, I just want to draw your attention to this card that Kara and I received this past week from an organization that rents some of our space in the office annex at a discount because we believe in their mission. And they are the Portland People's Outreach Project. They serve some of the people that would be most easily identified in our society as being among the sinners, those who you would not want to sit down at table with. They serve the drug addicts, the people that are in our camps, on our streets, who are addicted to drugs, who commit crimes to sustain their habits, but who are human beings made in the image of God. And what they do is they provide needle kits and supplies and the drug, naloxone, that helps save lives. And they do save lives. And they do that's possible because they use our space. And so I just wanted to read this one statement from one of their leaders, Sam, who wrote, "I appreciate your kindness, graciousness, and willingness to host P-Pop. Thanks a ton. It means so much to so many people. The things you have done for our organization and everyone else embodies the values of unconditional love and compassion that we all strive for. There's no way we could express our gratitude, but hopefully this is a start. You might want to think about joining them. They offer trainings, and they have sessions where they just put together kits, and even if you don't feel comfortable going out on the streets, they're always looking for volunteers to help get their supplies together. They are doing the work of Jesus. Well, in the end, we might think about the fact that God searches for these people so diligently, and we are called to do the same. And if you go back to that first idea of Plutarch and Theophrastus, that the company we keep imprints itself on us, we might turn the tables on Theophrastus and Plutarch and the Pharisees and remind ourselves and one another that the truest imprint on a human life is the image of God. And because every human being, lost or found, is created in God's image, we cannot rest until all are welcome and none are lost. Amen.